If I could make a recipe to describe the USA between 1970 and the turn of the century, I might put a pinch of Cold War antics, a dash of conservatism, and a little bit of Bill Clinton. My name is Anish, and this is my final video on the USA's 20th century, which is going to cover US history from the Nixon era to the end of the Cold War. So my last video ended on a bit of a dark note with the Vietnam War, which severely hurt America's international image and completely divided the nation. Lyndon Baines Johnson decided not to run for president in 1969, and Richard Nixon comes into office at quite a difficult time. But let's start on a positive note, as the USA have just beaten the Soviets in a space race, as Neil Armstrong became the first man to ever moonwalk. Nixon also has some pretty big foreign policy successes. So the Soviet Union and China had recently gone through a bit of a bad breakup, and Nixon wanted to exploit this. The USA had a bit of a bad history of communist China, but they started dialogue again, scrapped their long-standing trade embargo, and they even played a game of ping pong. The Soviets knew that a relationship between China and the USA would be very dangerous for them, so they started to develop some dialogue with the US, and tensions started to ease, beginning a period called détente. Nixon's visit to Moscow in 1972 resulted in the signing of two major arms limitation treaties, and to give him credit, Nixon had managed to warm relations with both of America's traditional Cold War enemies. There were some not so good moments as well. Nixon was absolutely ruthless in his bombings of North Vietnam. He did some very dodgy things in Chile and Henry Kissinger. Do I need to say any more? But now let's talk economics. So since the end of the Second World War, we have a period called the Golden Age of Capitalism, in which Western Europe, Japan, and the United States experienced a period of high and sustained economic growth, which is great, but in 1973, it all went to pot. What triggered this crisis was an oil embargo from some Arab states after the USA had backed Israel in the Yom Kippur War. But this economic crisis was different, and what followed was a period of high inflation and high unemployment, which economists didn't even know was possible, so they had no clue how to fix it. And then Nixon, being the very shady and paranoid fellow that he is, gets into a lot of trouble when a scandal starts to emerge involving him. So here's the story. In June of 1971, there was a break-in of the Democratic Party headquarters in Washington, D.C. But the burglars were caught and arrested, and it turned out that they were all connected to an organization called the Committee for the Re-Election of the President, the fundraising campaign for Richard Nixon. Yes, their acronym was CREEP. You can't write this stuff. Nixon tried to cover it up, but recordings of his conversations with White House officials were revealed, and this was a smoking gun tape that proved that the president was behind the break-in and the cover-up from the very beginning. Nixon resigned in disgrace in 1974, and for some reason, he was pardoned by Gerald Ford. The public completely lost their faith in central government, which is why a nice guy like Jimmy Carter comes into office. Jimmy Carter does inherit a lot of problems when he comes in, but his presidency was definitely not the best. He couldn't fix the economic problems, and his foreign policy, he really champions human rights. The issue with that is that a fair few of America's allies didn't show much respect for human rights themselves. The USA was backing leaders like Joseph Mobutu in Congo, and were kind of turning a blind eye to China. Then Iran has a revolution in 1978, and this was led by leftist and Islamic insurgents, who were very anti-Western. This probably has something to do with the fact that the USA may or may not have been involved in a coup in Iran in 1953. But as Jerry Seinfeld once said, no one holds a grudge like Khomeini. This revolution brought an end to the Shah of Iran, and one of America's closest and most reliable allies completely turned against them. Then some radicals stormed the US embassy in Tehran and took 66 American citizens hostage. And the fate of these hostages was something that the American public were passionately watching. It would take over a year though for these hostages to return home, and Jimmy Carter does not come out well from it. Since then, the USA has had a very rocky relationship with Iran. A year later, and the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and the USA are like, what the hell is going on in this part of the world? Even Jimmy Carter becomes a proper anti-communist hardliner, and the Cold War really starts to heat up. So now we're in the 1980s, and Michael Jackson becomes the second man to moonwalk. In comes Ronald Reagan, and he runs his presidential campaign under the slogan, "Let's make America great again." Wait a second. Reagan goes full free market, and his economic policy meant huge tax cuts and lots of deregulation to revive the entrepreneurial spirit of the American economy, with the idea that if businesses started doing better, this would trickle down to the rest of the people. Reagan was also full guns blazing anti-communist, very much a man of his time, and he claims that the USA is going to win the Cold War and roll back communism. Reagan really ramps up US defense spending and starts a whole new arms race, even investing in lasers in space called the Star Wars program. And no, he wasn't trying to build a Death Star, although it wouldn't surprise me. He starts some trash talk and calls the Soviet Union an evil empire, and got involved in a lot of proxy wars in Afghanistan, Angola and Nicaragua. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, I'd say that the year of 1983 was probably the most intense that the Cold War has ever become. But Reagan also got into a bit of trouble with the Iran-Contra scandal. So there was a group in Nicaragua called the Contras who were committing a lot of human rights abuses, and Congress said that the US was not going to fund them. But at the same time, the Contras were fighting a Marxist government. So in Reagan's eyes, he was like, oh, what the hell, let's give them some money. Let's just hope no one finds out. So basically, the US government made a deal in which it would sell weapons to one of its enemies, Iran, in return for some money and the release of some hostages in Lebanon. Some of the money from the arms sale with Iran would then go on to fund the Contras, ignoring Congress and completely violating the Constitution. The scandal got caught, and although Reagan wasn't impeached, his reputation was definitely damaged. But in 1985, the whole dynamics of the Cold War completely changed because of this beautiful man, Mikhail Gorbachev, who comes into power in the USSR and dramatically shifts Soviet policy. Reagan and Gorbachev start to build a personal relationship, and trust began to develop. The two powers signed the INF Treaty in 1987, and the 4-decade-long conflict ended towards the end of the 1980s. And then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, which really ended the conflict. Reagan finished his second term, and George Bush Sr. oversaw the demise of a lot of communist countries around the world, and kind of just let events play themselves out, and everything was smooth sailing, except in the Middle East, when the world was completely taken by surprise when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. Everyone soon realised that if Iraq's dictator Saddam Hussein was successful, then he would control over 20% of the world's oil supply. Again, it was like, are you just going to sit back and let aggressive dictators do this? Hell no. This is the USA. So the US and other UN forces going guns blazing and won a very short and decisive war against Iraq, displaying their modern, high-tech military machine. But they decided not to overthrow Saddam Hussein's government, and I'm sure that's the last we'll hear of him. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the USA once again became the sole superpower in the world, and the US enjoys a period of economic prosperity. Bill Clinton came in and really focused on economic growth, and massively expands foreign trade. Globalisation really took off in the 90s, and you get huge multinational corporations like Nike and Microsoft, and American cultural icons like Michael Jordan taking over global markets. But at the end of the term, Clinton also gets into a bit of trouble with the whole affair with the secretary thing. Poor Hillary. But that pretty much sums up the 20th century, and that's where I'll end. I hope you've enjoyed this video and the series, and if you did, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And the next country I'm going to cover is my motherland, India. See you then.